Welcome to this episode of the Inspirational Creatives podcast, episode 291, brought to you by the Inspirational Creatives app, which you can now find on your favourite smartphone app store. To celebrate 6 years of this podcast, you can download the Inspirational Creatives app to access all of my content, every single episode since this podcast began in 2014, and for free. To take your live creativity and profession to the next level, connect directly with me and my content by searching for the Inspirational Creatives app on your favourite smartphone app store. Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and welcome to another episode of Inspirational Creatives. My guest today is the first British woman to have skied to the magnetic North Pole. She brings executive coaching and is an example of leadership to charities and non-profit organisations with the aim of addressing some of the greatest humanitarian and environmental challenges of our time. As well as carrying out a number of pro bono activities as a coach, co-founder and podcast host for Access to Inspiration, she has a successful corporate career behind her. And more recently, I've had the pleasure of working with her on a number of projects, including the Coaching in the Workplace virtual conference podcast earlier this year for the Association for Coaching. So I'm delighted to introduce to you today, Sue Stockdale. Sue, welcome.
Hi, Rob. Thanks for inviting me on the podcast.
That's great to have you on the show. So before we begin, and for our listener, is there anything you would add to that introduction just to help our listener get a sense of who you are?
Well, I suppose the thing that's at the heart of me, Rob, is really about enabling others to maximise their potential. And if I was like a stick of rock to be cut in half, that's what you would read on the sticker inside.
That's great. So tell me more about that in terms of, in your mind, what does it mean for someone to be working towards reaching their potential?
I think it means helping people to have a sense of curiosity about what they are capable of and a willingness to try to go and explore on that journey so that they ultimately can get that sense of realization that they can achieve more than they ever imagined was possible, and that they are therefore exploring what they are actually capable of. And that's a really exciting thing, because maybe they're doing things that they never thought they could. Maybe they're exploring new territories. And by that, I don't mean traveling to a different part of the world, but just seeing what they're capable of. And I just think as human beings, we're on this planet for a fairly short amount of time. So why not actually see what we could achieve in that amount of time as a human being? That's what motivates me, Rob.
I love that. So would you say you've always sort of been restless in that sense? You know, what motivates you?
Yeah, well, I do have a great sense of curiosity. And I can remember as a wee girl, we would go on walks in the countryside as a family. And if there was a path heading into the forest, or a gate with a windy road or path behind it, I'd always be thinking, oh, I wonder where that goes. We ought to go and find out. I think that was because I read a lot of Enid Blyton's Famous Five and Secret Seven books, and I just loved the idea of going on adventures. Yeah,
that sense of adventure then. Can you remember the first time that you felt a desire to do something a little bit more out of the ordinary, something that was perhaps out of your comfort zone?
The first thing that springs to mind when you say that, Rob, was I was in the Brownies. And the Brownies used to have interest badges, so you could, I suppose, test your capabilities to see if you could be an athlete, or there was house orderly or book lover, things like that. And I remember that in our brownie pack, a number of the other brownies, along with me, had gone for a number of those interest badges. And there was only so many of them you could sew on the sleeve of your tunic when you received them. Well, I wanted to be the first one in our pack to get more than one column of badges on my arm. I wanted to see whether you could get 2 columns. So I always just used to open up the brownie handbook and read all the different interest badges and then say, oh, I'd love to try that. Let's go for it. So maybe that was my first foray into stepping out my comfort zone.
That's brilliant. And are there any particular badges that stick out in your mind that you remember getting that you were particularly proud of or eager to get?
Well, I think there was one called athlete or something like that, athlete or athletic or agility badge, maybe it was called. And we had a narrow brick wall around our church grounds where the brownies were held. And as part of the ability to be agile, the way that our pack judged that was one of the activities was to walk all the way around that wall on the top of the wall, sort of balancing like a balance beam. And that took me a few weeks to really master the ability to do that all the way around. So that's one that sticks out in my mind. Perhaps a little bit tame these days, but certainly it was a memory that was stuck in my head.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because you've got a background in athletics, haven't you? Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, well, when I was a teenager at school, I used to do sports like anybody else, I'm sure, would do at their school. And we had a teacher, Margot Wells, who was my PE teacher. Now, it so happened that her husband was called Alan Wells. And for those of the listeners that are old enough to remember, Alan Wells won the Olympics 100-metre title at the Moscow Olympics in 1980. And he was Scottish. And this was his wife that was my PE teacher. So what happened at school was that Alan Wells brought his gold medal along to the school and we all met him. And I just remember really being inspired by looking at him and his gold medal and thinking, wow, isn't that amazing? And, what it takes to achieve such a success. Now, whilst I didn't want to be a sprinter like him, it did inspire me to do more running. Mrs. Wells, as we knew her, she encouraged me to go along and join an athletics club because I seemed to enjoy running. And it was the local, at the time it was called Edinburgh Southern Harriers. So I used to go down to the athletics track at Meadowbank in Edinburgh on a Tuesday and a Thursday and join all the other girls in our group and do the training. And a lot of the time it was I didn't really enjoy it all that much, to be honest. So I left it after a couple of years. But then I think it was when I was 17, I decided that when I was 18, I'd like to run a marathon. That was the youngest age that you could apply to join the Edinburgh Marathon. So from the age of 17, I then went back to the athletics club and began training to run this marathon. Having done so at 18, I realised the marathon's a pretty long way and it would be far easier to run 3,000 metres on the track, which seemed an awful lot shorter. And nobody ever in the running club ever wanted to do 3,000. So I kind of fell into that role and then got pretty good at it. So that's how it all developed, really, from being inspired from Mrs. Wells' husband.
I love that. That's a great story. So were there any particular remarkable 3,000 metre achievements that you remember?
Well, I represented Scotland in a few events in cross-country and on the track. And really the pride of putting on a vest that has your country's name on it, really, it just makes you feel absolutely so fantastic. And it was a real accomplishment. And I think I've recognised, and this is something that's completely relevant today as well, Rob, is something like that doesn't happen overnight. It taken me, years of hard work, going to the track, as I said, 2 or 3 times a week, running pretty much every day, rain or shine, making sure that I finished every training session I was given, never giving up. That relentless ability to keep going serves me in good stead today, not only in the world of business, where sometimes times get tough and we have to keep going, but also on the many expeditions that I've done over the years. So the lessons I learned from the world of athletics, having a goal, working towards it, being prepared to make what I would call purposeful choices. Others might call them sacrifices. I think for me, it's about how you choose to use your time to pursue something that might mean that you have to say no to some other things. All of those lessons I learned from way back then doing athletics.
That's fascinating. You mentioned curiosity a moment ago, but you just mentioned there this sort of relentless ability that you have, this persistence, this commitment. Where do you think that comes from for you, Sue?
If you've ever done I think it's the Belbin team role analysis, there's a characteristic called completer finisher.
Aha, yes.
And I'm a completer finisher. So I think it just is innately within me to, when I start something, I want to make sure it's finished. So I'm not quite sure where that originally came from. But I think there's something about a sense of satisfaction in achievement. And whether it's writing finishing a piece of homework as a young child or completing a project as a business person, getting to the North Pole on an expedition, the idea that you can actually get to the end and have a sense of accomplishment, then I suppose it shows me that, I'm worth something, I've achieved something, that I can make things happen. So it's a self-satisfaction, I think.
That's a fascinating answer, actually, because I know there's a number of people that are great at starting projects, but they do struggle to complete them. Do you think that is something that can be taught, that quality that seems to be innate in you? In your experience as a coach working with others, is that something that you can use to lead by example with and help other people develop?
Well, perhaps if I could just take the question and look at it in a slightly different way, Rob, thinking about if I'm a good completer finisher, what I'm not so great at is starting with a blank sheet of paper.
Right.
So that's where I find it difficult. What I've learned to do over the years, because I know that that's not my strength, is engage others in helping me to do that. So if I'm faced with a project where there is that write down your first idea, I normally then seek out somebody who I know is great at shaping conversations and being innovative at the outset. And then along with them, that blank sheet of paper suddenly gets filled with ideas. So what I've done is find a catalyst to help me overcome that weakness of mine. So thinking about your question about completer finisher is helping those that I work with is to think about who can support them to make that task happen. How else will they, and that can be sometimes just a case of a check sheet or a document that will help them to check in every day about what progress they've made. It could be a colleague, a peer that will help them. It could be me as their coach. So I think it is a recognition that we aren't all things to all people, and we do all have strengths in different ways. Acknowledge that, embrace it, and therefore look for people who can work with you to fill in those gaps where maybe they're not your areas of strength. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because we can be, yes, successful on our own, but we can be far more successful when we work collaboratively with others.
I get that, yeah. And having worked with you on a number of projects, I know that you're an advocate for diversity, and I mean that in the broadest sense and also in the most complex sense too. I want to ask you more about your backstory before we get into some of the details here, but would you say that has contributed to your success so far, having teams of diversity?
Yes, absolutely. I'm trying to think back to, if there's ever been a time where I've just been with a team who's been lots of people who perhaps have got similar characteristics or traits to me. Well, I can think that they are often nice at the outset because it's easy to connect with those people who share similar attributes. But are they fulfilling in the long term? No, because maybe we'd get jobs finished, but we wouldn't perhaps have the imagination and the creativity along the way that's required. We wouldn't seek different views if everyone was like me. So I just think they, consciously or unconsciously at the outset, always been in groups where there is quite a diversity of thinking, background, views, gender, geography. Even as far back as my first ever expedition, which was back in 1988, I joined an expedition with Rally International, which is a charity. And they take groups of young people, obviously not currently during COVID times, but they were taking young people to remote parts of the world to carry out, in my day, it was called Scientific Community and Adventure Projects. And I arrived in northern Kenya in 1988 with 120 other young people from all around the world. And then we were split up into groups of 8 or 10 people to work on these different types of projects. And in my group, I had people from many different countries. There was a young lad who was deaf. We had a local Kenyan. There was somebody from New Zealand, America. And I suppose I didn't necessarily really even think about it then. They were just people that were there to get some great experience. That, for me, was probably just the start of actually being part of global teams, but not really realising it at that time. It's just always been there. Yeah,
it's fascinating. No, it's very insightful, Sue. I love that. And it's really interesting hearing that little bit of your story there and knowing the person that you are today and how that comes out in the world and how some of those early experiences perhaps would have shaped you. Talking of which, I don't want to avoid the conversation or the story about your trip to the magnetic North Pole. Tell me about that. At what point in your life did that come about and how did it come about?
It came about at the time, or just before I saw that expedition. I'll give you a bit of the backstory, Rob, here.
Please, yeah.
I'd worked as a corporate career for 11 years in British Gas. I started 2 weeks after my 16th birthday in my first ever job. And I could have gone to university, but I chose to get a job that paid me money and gave me day release. So I was 1 day a week I could go to college. And in my view, that was the best of both worlds. Earn money and learn at the same time. And that continued for a number of years within British Gas. As I was, I suppose, fast-tracking my career, I was one of the youngest ever senior managers. But after 11 years there, I really did hanker after having something more adventurous. And I remember going to my boss and with a job opportunity I'd seen. And I said to him, what do you think? And I really did trust his opinion. I said, do you think I should take this job that I've been offered, or should I stay here? And he said, knowing you, Sue, you're really adventurous. I can't see you getting your gold watch for 25 years service here, as much as we'd love to keep you. He said, I think you should go and have the adventure. Now, maybe he was trying to get rid of me and he was doing it politely, but I think he had my best interests at heart. And that job that I went on to was a 1-year contract in a war zone working with the United Nations. And that really taught me about risk-taking and stepping into the unknown, and actually that you could learn a lot by doing that. So that gave me a lot of confidence. It taught me also how organisations which aren't like British Gas perhaps operate in quite different ways, maybe a bit more bureaucratic and longer to make things happen. It also showed me what it was, the reality of what a war zone was like, and the contrast between what we read in the press and what actually happens on the ground. So that was fascinating. And then, having come back from that year in the UN, I was sitting in my garden and I spotted this advert in the newspaper, and it said, wanted 10 novice Arctic explorers to ski 350 miles to the magnetic North Pole. Now, I don't know how often you see adverts like that these days, but there were 2 qualifications that the advert was asking for. The first was the ability to work in a team. Now, I knew I could do that. I'd been to Kenya with Raleigh and I'd worked at the UN, so I knew I could do the team working bit. And the second qualification was the ability to raise £15,000, which is about $25,000, to pay for your place on the expedition. Now, I had absolutely no idea how to do that. Back in 94, which this was, 1994, I probably could have bought a house for that amount of money. But I said to myself, if it's meant to be, I'll find a way. So I was curious. I said to myself, I wonder what it's like to survive in the Arctic for a month in the cold. I really want to find that out. Perhaps I was just a step up from those brownie badges when I was young. And would you believe that when I sent off for the application form, it came back and it was all a lovely coloured brochure, all pictures of men, and on the front it said, are you man enough for the ultimate challenge? Well, you can imagine what I thought as a woman.
I can, yeah.
So I applied, and, as you say, the rest is history.
Amazing. So tell me about that expedition and what it taught you.
Well, I think the first thing it taught me is that to get to the start line, the preparation can be as difficult as the expedition itself. Because just like starting up a business, we can have a good idea, we can have a vision, but to make it happen, you need resources. And I had to find some way of, first of all, getting in the team, and secondly, raising that £15,000. So in terms of the preparation, there was a whole series of selection tests that I think about 500 people applied for the places on the team. And there was a whole series of different tests to narrow down who was to be picked. One of the things I think that really helped me in that regard was we did a military assault course at Sandhurst, the military college in the UK. And I remember having to climb over a rope ladder. So it was about 30 feet off the ground. You climbed up the rope ladder on one side, over the top and down the other side. And everybody raced off at the start, going over all the different obstacles. We got to the rope ladder and I just froze because I have a fear of heights. And climbing up one side was hard enough, but to put your leg over the top and then feel rather unstable to go down the other side, I just absolutely froze. And I thought, that's it, I've failed now, I'll be no good. What happened was several of the other people who were also competing for places stopped and helped me. And I got over the ladder and we carried on. And at the end of that, when this, everybody eventually was selected, the organisers said, we weren't looking for elite individuals, we were looking for team players. And that was a measure of who was willing to be a team player, is to potentially forgo winning the race for your teammates.
How interesting.
So I think that, that's another great lesson for business. We can be great individuals, but if we're working in a team, are you there for your teammates at those tough times? Then not to mention that, the raising the money to get the £15,000, I wrote a lot of letters, a little bit like we might do if we were pitching for money from an investor these days, if we're running a business. You've got to think about, well, why would somebody want to support you? What's in it for them? Always look at it from the other person's perspective. There were two good reasons why a sponsor would want to help in the situation that I was in. The first was that we were going to be filmed by the BBC. So, of course, a sponsor could get their logo and branding on my clothing, if possible. And they would get television coverage. And secondly, what I then discovered was that I potentially could be the first British woman to get there. And that probably would make a bit of a press story as well. So putting those arguments into the documents and sending them out, I thought, well, people will be interested to sign up. Of course, I got millions of no's. It was in the days prior really to email, so it was a lot of letters in the post. Most people didn't bother to reply, and those that did said no. The time was ticking closer and closer to the expedition. This was about January. We were leaving in May, or the end of April, to be fair. If we didn't get the money, we wouldn't be on the team. And eventually I heard from Bird's Eye Fish Fingers. And I went along to meet the woman to have an exploratory conversation. And the first thing she said to me was, "Oh, Sue, I see on your letter you've been on a rally expedition. I've just come back as a sponsored employee with Bird's Eye from a particular country with rally." Now, there was the common connection. Now, I didn't say that because of that reason they gave me the money, which they ultimately did. But that power of networking, and you never could know where the value of a relationship will stand you in good stead in the future. So all of those things, it's not even in the Arctic, were lessons that I've taken from that whole process that are valuable in later life. So that's us. We've not even got to the start line, but those are a couple of things that I learned along the way.
Yeah, amazing. And what about since then? I mean, you must reflect on that expedition and how it's affected your life since then. What happened next?
Well, we did do the expedition, led by a famous explorer, David Hempelman Adams. So there were 4 experienced people and there were 10 novices. We took 30 days skiing, dragging sledges, weighing over the weight of an average person. And, there was such a camaraderie that when we got to the North Pole in the end, it was actually sad to think that although we'd accomplished our objective, we would no longer be as a team, because we'd had shared those highs and lows and, tears and laughter along the way. So I learned it was as much about the journey as it was about the end goal that is really important. But it's to be fair to say that expedition really changed my life. Firstly, it made me realise that I had never imagined I could do something like that. And yet here I was having done it. So imagine if other people could have that same experience. And I thought maybe something about my own expedition experience, rather than those photographs just going in an album in my own house, how could I use them for a bigger purpose? How could I use them for good? Maybe they could start to form the story that would inspire other people to think about how could they get to their equivalent North Pole. And since then, the first thing I did was to start up in business as a motivational speaker, using those lessons learned from not only that expedition, but a couple of other ones I did subsequently to different other cold places. And I think the second thing is that's the if you like, the accolade of being first British woman has opened the doors to so many amazing opportunities. And I've met so many fascinating and interesting people purely because they're curious to understand what it's like being a polar explorer. So it's really, it changed the nature of what I was doing with my career and how life has ended up.
Amazing, yeah. Something we haven't touched upon, which I know you do, is you give talks, and I guess you talk about your expedition amongst other things. Could you tell me a little bit about the public speaking that you do?
Yeah, well, I think it really is taking that principle of helping people to maximise their potential through using the story of one of my expeditions as the backdrop, and then sharing some of those life lessons, some of those business lessons that we can glean from it. A little bit for example, like in Greenland, I did an expedition in Greenland, and there's a lot of crevasses in Greenland at the edge of the ice cap, which we were skiing across. And I use that as an example to say, what are the crevasse zones in your organisation? What are the things that you could put one foot wrong and it could spell disaster? And how do you still take risks and cross those crevasse zones safely enough whilst recognising that they may be there? I gave an exact example of a story. There were 4 of us on that trip, and I had the most experience. And as we got into the trip, I realised that I was the slowest. And at first of all, I couldn't believe that other people in the team had the audacity to ski faster than me. Because, you know, how could we possibly ski at that speed for a whole month? And that they didn't have the experience. We would tire us out too quickly. So I got frustrated, but I couldn't tell them that because they were further ahead than me. I couldn't catch up with them. And then I then thought I would cry because I would just feel sorry for myself. Poor me. Well, all that happened is my goggles froze and I couldn't see where I was going. So that strategy didn't work.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we get into that victim mode in our businesses and our lives. So that I thought, well, that's not a good idea. So the next thing was I just said, well, you'll just have to keep going, Sue, one step in front of the other. Just keep moving. And you know, I think that's the thing, that when we face challenging times, well, no one else is going to do the work for us. We've just got to keep going, and eventually, after you've taken enough small steps, after a week, after a day, you can look back and see that maybe you have made progress, and that progress in itself is a motivation to take more progress. So that's where I'm a great advocate of having a big goal, but breaking it down into small enough steps that you can do something every single day to make it happen.
That's fascinating. I love that, Sue. And something you touched upon there, which I'd like to ask you more about, is your attitude towards risk. You mentioned risk there and the importance of taking risk. What's your sort of philosophy or approach towards risk, and how do you work with others to help them manage their own?
Well, I think there's understanding that risk-taking is, there will always be successes and failures. That is the nature of life. And if we were to map out, as if it was like a sort of temperature chart you could see in the hospital, if you were to map out your own life and say, mark out where the significant highs were and mark out where the significant lows were, I would pretty much guarantee that most people would have a degree of variation on that chart. And what that can tell you when you look at life across the piece over a long period of time, you can see that we don't just live a straight line life where there's not any significant highs or lows. There's always going to be contrast. And that is the nature of risk, that we can learn a lot from those lows, because sometimes those are our biggest life lessons, and we can learn a lot from the highs. So it's going in with an expectation of success and failure. And I think these days I find it rather sad in society that we're almost trying to create that straight line of life as opposed to having the line go up and down. We want to minimise the potential problems, the potential downsides, but we don't recognise that there's potential upsides as well. So I think it's about getting people to think about risk-taking as expecting failure and expecting success. In fact, I interviewed for one of the books that I wrote about risk along with a colleague of mine, Clive Steeper. We interviewed a guy who was a professional poker player, and we asked him about how does he view risk-taking. And his answer was, if I'm going into a game, I'm expecting to lose 9 out of 10 hands that I play in cards. But I know that in the one hand where I'm going to win, I'll win big. And it's that going into the idea of expecting losses to have one big gain is exactly the same back to my athletics days. You know, I'd expect to not run my best time on every time I went out training, but I know in the race I'd try and do the best I could. So I think helping people as a coach to identify that there are all of the different approaches to risk-taking. Some people are prudent, some people are wary, others are adventurous, others are excitable. In fact, there's a great tool that I use with clients called the Risk Type Compass that's been developed by another organisation, PCL. They talk about that you can see risk then in a broader sense, not just looking at it from your own individual perspective. And that means then you can maybe move from where you are. So I'm the adventurous risk type, but that can mean sometimes I jump in to the pond first and then realise there's no water in it. So maybe I have to be more prudent at times. And back to the team working analogy, work with those around me who may be able to say, well, Sue, what if? They ask a question that maybe I wouldn't ask, and therefore it gives me a broader perspective. So that's, I guess it's about looking at it not in detail at one's individual situation, but taking a step back and trying to look more broadly at the whole idea of risk taking.
Yeah, that's a really fresh perspective on risk, listening to what you had to say there. And I like this idea of actually, I think we do become, as a society, we have become a bit risk averse in the sense that it's a bit too scary rather than actually looking at the upside of taking risks, as you mentioned there. With all of that in mind, could you tell me about Mission Possible rather than Mission Impossible? I like this. So there's a theme here of kind of flipping things on their head, I'm starting to see. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about that and how that all came about.
Yeah, that was a business that I started and then grew and then sold it. And it was in the work, doing my work as a motivational speaker, a lot of the time I was in front of audiences that were predominantly female. And I realised that a lot of the women were saying, help us to, build confidence. We want to run our own businesses. We want to do more things than we currently are. How can we do that? So this was in the late 90s, and it was kind of the early days of portals, if you like, for websites. These days we all go to the big ones, don't we, when we're looking for information. So basically I created a portal. Mission Possible was about helping women to see what entrepreneurial resources were within their part of the UK. So it told them about training courses that were on. It gave them inspirational interviews with role models, all the sorts of resources that can help a woman to start up and grow their own business. And it was using technology to help them get that information. We also ran a series of networking groups in different parts of the UK to help them to learn from and be supported by other women entrepreneurs in their area. But as I grew that business, which is what I kind of thought I was meant to be doing, I actually realised along the way that what my heart wasn't in leading an organisation and growing something big. And it was a tough decision, but the best one I ever made, to say, that's not what I'm about. My skills lie elsewhere. And actually, if I want to be maximising my own potential, I need to step back out of this and get back to doing what I do best, which is kind of inspiring people in a different way rather than leading an organisation. So I could have shut the business down, found someone else to run it, or sell it. Those were my three options. And I chose to sell it. So after having grown it for 5 or so years, I was able to sell it to another organisation that were working in a similar space, in which the areas that I had been focusing on geographically were gaps in their areas of business. So it was a lovely complementary match. But it was a great lesson for me about, follow one's own advice and know really what your strengths are and follow those strengths.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions around that I'd love to ask you. The first one is, how did you go about selling your business? Was that an easy thing to do?
Yeah, well, it wasn't necessarily easy, and because it's kind of odd that when you think, well, what's going to happen if I let competitors know that I'm up for sale? Is it going to sound like I'm failing or something's not working? And so I'd been out in the entrepreneurial world for a while by that time. I'd been. So I spoke to people that were further on down the line, people who'd sold their businesses before. I read the literature that was out there about how it was done. And very often I was told that, start with people who know you well already and sometimes who might be already in your industry, to just put the sort of word out that you might be selling. So that's what I did. I approached several people quietly that were in a similar industry, or people that I knew that might be interested in the sort of work that we were doing, and just began to sort of float the conversation. And in the end, one of those conversations then, turned into a sale. But what I realised was, even before that, is the ability to dispassionately and objectively look at the value that you're generating within your business, because you need to have something to sell in the first place. It's not, if it's a one-person band, is there some actual assets, if you like, that you're selling? The know-how, it might be your database of contacts, what's the value that someone else is going to gain? So I thought that was a great exercise. Even if I hadn't sold the business, it was a great exercise in actually stepping back and saying, what have we created here? And from the outset of setting up Mission Possible, I'd always started up with a principle that it wasn't just, if you like, a lifestyle business that didn't have proper structure and systems in place. So we had built it from the start in a way, perhaps I knew it was always going to be sold, that, built ready for sale with the right systems and processes and, documentation, contracts, all of those things that somebody wants to know you've got a robust business in place when they might want to come and buy it.
Yeah.
So that was how it worked in the end. It was an individual conversation with a few people that led eventually to a sale.
So you'd built this business up, and it was essentially, it's this thing that you were probably quite close to. Can you remember the moment where you realised that actually you're no longer playing to your strengths here, or you're not advancing at the rate that you feel you'd like to be? Can you remember that moment where you were able to have that level of objectivity and realise that this was the right thing for you to do?
Absolutely. I was sitting in a friend's office and I was, metaphorically banging my head against the brick wall. Why is it not working in the way that I want it to? I'm really frustrated. And this was a really good friend. She was also an entrepreneur, and we were sitting having this coffee, and she sort of just looked me in the eye and she said, Sue, you could always sell it. You could always move on and do something else. And just the way that she said that, and that moment, and trusting in her insight, I remember just sort of somehow thinking, wow, I could just free myself of this frustration. Life could be different. And contemplating a new possibility. And there's that kind of pivotal moment, just being open to accept something different. And I remember just walking out of her office and just feeling a lightness of my steps as I was walking. I was thinking, that's it. I'm going to sell the business. I'm going to move on. And that's going to be how it is. I had this renewed sense of energy, rather than fighting something that was frustrating and wasn't going my way, was just to let it go and actually trust that, the next right thing will come along. And it was such a freeing conversation as a result. So that's how it happened.
That's brilliant. And what was the next right thing that came along?
Well, I then decided to, if you like, go back to reminding myself what I was good at. And that's, in a way, how the executive coaching then continued on with a greater focus. So, we'd been doing coaching as part of the offerings within Mission Possible. So, I already knew I could do that. I could do the motivational speaking, which had taken a backseat to some degree. So all of those things, then I went back and said, well, like, what's in my toolbox? What are the things I actually have that I can sell to other people that will reinforce this message inside of me about helping people to maximize their potential? So I just, I took a step back. I took a deep breath and said, based on my values and what's important for me and who I want to work with, how am I going to get out there and spread the message? And the one thing I think, reflecting on it now, that I perhaps did that has served me well is have that abundance mentality. So, I've been blogging for probably over 10, 12 years now. So writing, sharing my knowledge through blogs, not expecting people to pay for that knowledge, just to give it out to people. Being willing to support, perhaps in a non-profit sense, other people, helping them to maximise their potential. And it's sometimes been through those unexpected ways of just giving back with no expectation of anything coming back in return, that something has come back, not necessarily from those individuals, but somehow the universe gives me another opportunity through a connection in a different relationship. So that's really how I still show up today, is to say, if I can give out of my best work and not necessarily, always be expecting a fee back in return, if I can do good, the universe will supply me with some interesting opportunities in return. And sure enough, that has happened.
Yeah, fascinating. So we're both coaches and we haven't really talked much about coaching. I'd love to learn more about you as a coach and the value of coaching as you see it. I mean, I realise our listener may not be that familiar with coaching and what a coach is, so maybe we could start there. But I'd also love to learn how you discovered coaching.
Well, when I was in British Gas all those years ago, I worked part of that time in the training and development function. So we were developing management training, and that enabling style of leadership, if you like, supporting people through is almost called mentoring in those days. But asking questions rather than telling. Those management ideas were starting to be introduced into the organisation at the latter time when I was there. So it wasn't called coaching, but there was an idea about how do you empower and engage people by asking questions to draw the knowledge out of them, as opposed to being perhaps that command and control and more autocratic style of leadership. So that was where I came across it initially. And then as I set up in business as a speaker and then morphed into doing coaching as well, I went along to the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. Every year have an annual conference and exhibition. It used to be at Olympia when we were allowed out in the real world to see people. And I went along there and most people going to those sorts of events are normally going to attend and participate. I saw this as a sales opportunity. I thought, what better way to find out what's out in the marketplace than by going round the stands, introducing myself to the training companies, the leadership companies, whoever's exhibiting at the exhibition, find out what's going on, and actually just maybe there'll be an opportunity to be an associate for some organisations or to just pick up what's going on. Well, as luck would have it, one of the organisations that was exhibiting at the expedition was called Performance Consultants. And of course, the founder of Performance Consultants was Sir John Whitmore, who we would know these days as the grandfather of coaching with the GROW model and his book, Coaching for Performance.
Yes.
So I got into conversation with John and his colleagues, who were David Hemery and David Whittaker. So all of those people came into the world of coaching from the world of sport. And for example, David Hemery was the 400-metre hurdle Olympic champion and world record holder, and he was part of that. He was there at the exhibition. So I got chatting to David, and he said, "Tell me about what you do and everything." He presumably was hoping I would be a potential client of theirs. But as we got chatting, I talked about my expedition background. I talked about my training and development background. And he said, "Oh, you sound like you really have got the same connection as we have. Would you be interested in being an associate with us?" And that was it. Talk about being able to start at the top. I learned from the best as working with them as one of their associates and introducing coaching skills into organisations. So I really got the best grounding in how the GROW model is, I guess, meant to be used and on what basis it was created by working with those that did write that book and create the model along with others.
That's remarkable.
So that's how I kind of got into the world of coaching.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I didn't know that story, so that's absolutely fascinating to hear. So from our listeners' point of view then, perhaps trying to get a sense of how a coach can support them, I'd be interested to know, perhaps from your perspective, Sue, as somebody who's been coached, how has coaching helped you? What have been the benefits of coaching as you see it?
Well, I think I must say that my husband is also an executive coach. So very often I can be coached having my breakfast cereal in the morning.
Yes.
So it's just a way of life these days. But I think what it is think back to that blank paper analogy I was talking about, starting up a project or having an idea. How coaching has helped me is somebody who can then start to ask me some questions. So, for example, the podcast that I run, Access to Inspiration, myself and my co-founder, we were together sort of talking about the way that we feel inspiration. There are lots of inspirational people, but why does the world always look to celebrities and the big name influencers as being the only sources of inspiration? And we were talking about this, and then I said, well, I'd really like, I'd love it to be a podcast. And then my colleague said to me, well, in a way, he began to ask me some coaching questions. Well, what do you mean by podcast? And what would it have to be like? And who could be on it? And what would have to happen to make it happen? And he began to ask me questions. And that was then formulating my thinking. So all of a sudden, that blank piece of paper that I'm used to be fearful of was now starting to get populated with ideas. And then he was asking the very questions I'd be asking of other people. So what would be the first thing you'd have to do to make that happen? Who could help me to do it? And what he was doing was helping me to examine my own thinking, to get motivation and then to identify some actions. So he wasn't doing the work, I was doing the work. He was facilitating my thinking. And effectively, that's what I think coaching is helping somebody else to facilitate their thinking. Effectively raise their own awareness about something. Because when we have more awareness, we have choice. We can do things differently. And then through that, we have the motivation for action. And, as I say, it's a simple in concept, difficult sometimes to put into practice when you're on the receiving end. So that's what coaching means to me. And I've certainly been the recipient of great coaching questions over the years to help me make some of my projects happen.
That's great, Sue. I really like that perspective and that example that you gave there. I think that's a really nice, succinct insight as to what coaching is, certainly from my experience being coached and as a coach as well. You've worked with a number of charities and non-profits, and you've helped them bring executive coaching into their leadership. What would you say that, from that perspective, I mean, it's been an interesting year to say the least, 2020. But without going into all of that, what opportunities do you see in the world today from a coach's perspective?
I think people who are coaches and using coaching skills have got massive opportunities in all sectors. So not just not-for-profits and charities. I think to make a difference to society is the skill of asking better questions is really at the forefront of it. The willingness to have to listen at a deep level, if you like, to others. And that requires time and interest in other people. So, if you think about, perhaps this comes back to the conversation about running we were having earlier, Rob. I used to love running because running is a very simple sport. You put on your shorts and t-shirt, a pair of training shoes, and you're off. Requires nothing else. Very simple. Coaching is exactly the same for me. It's really easy. It's having the desire, the belief, the innate curiosity about somebody else and what is their potential and what could they do. So believing positive. Engaging with them by asking questions, showing curiosity, listening to their answers, and just giving them attention. In the world these days, people are so lacking of attention, meaningful attention. Everybody is broadcasting information. We can see it on social media. It's all about spouting forth and telling. Who's doing the listening? And that's where there's a shortage. So, equivalent to putting on your shorts and t-shirt and your training shoes is to put on your coaching ears and being willing to listen. Sitting down rather than moving and not taking time for somebody and giving them full attention. That in itself is gold dust. And very often the leaders I work with in all organisations, large and small, global and local, is the power of doing that is unbelievable. They can then have that quality moment of thinking. They can then talk through perhaps what their fears and concerns are. And even just a nudge with a question or a moment of support or giving them some positive feedback will get them off and it catalyses them into action, in taking new decisions, facing new directions. So we don't necessarily, at the outset, of course there's important other things that go around formal coaching sessions and so on, but at the heart of it, we can all learn the skill of listening and being there for somebody else. So maybe we could think about the analogy of the shorts, t-shirt and training shoes of coaching.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? That sometimes the simplest things in life can be the most powerful. And what you just kindly shared there with our listener, Sue, is something that I believe anybody can develop. Anybody can really develop that capacity to essentially create an environment, I suppose, and a term I know we both know of psychological safety, a space where somebody can express themselves and be properly listened to.
Absolutely. It's so important. And if we can help others to cultivate that skill, then I think that, we are serving the world well.
That's fantastic. So I think we're going to leave it on that high. So I've got a few closing questions I'd love to ask you, Sue, before we wrap up, conscious of time. What's inspired you in the last week?
Being out in nature. My husband and I, we go for a walk every morning, and just to go out every day and observe the moment, obviously the change of colours in the autumn on the leaves, and noticing the wonderfulness of nature, and just being able to take that time to enjoy it in the morning and not be thinking about what's next. Just being in the moment really inspires me every single morning, even if it's raining.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It's such a stunning time of year. And also that your point there about being out in nature, I think that's something else that we mustn't forget. Again, coming back to that theme of simple things being powerful. I think that's quite an easy thing for somebody to do. And it can often be a very good resetting, grounding type experience, I find, if we find ourselves overwhelmed or in a little bit of a muddle. One of the best things we can do is follow your lead there, Sue, and get outside, even if it is raining.
Absolutely.
So what would you say you're grateful for, Sue?
I think I'm grateful certainly for my health. As one gets, I'm in my mid 50s almost. As one gets on in years, I think one values health more and more. Particularly, health is a big topic globally at the moment, as we all know. So I think just being able to do the things physically and mentally that I want to, it's as simple as that. If I make sure I eat the right foods, we've got time at the moment doing less world travel to be at home. I love cooking. So we've had all of the wonderful harvest of apples and things from the garden recently. So I make, well, hopefully my husband would describe them as delicious, but I try to make meals that are delicious and enjoyable and home cooked. So those simple pleasures ensure that hopefully I maintain good health as well.
Amazing. Yeah, that's fantastic. Great. And what's next for you, Sue? I mean, you've got a fascinating story, and I know we jumped around a lot there, but I just learned so much more about you in our short conversation today. It was really quite amazing. So what's next for you, though, Sue?
Well, I think just to follow up from what you've said there, Rob, I do know that there's quite a lot of diverse things that I've done in my career so far. I'm trying to work out a way of writing them, whether it's a book or a memoir or something. I'm not even sure anyone would want to read it, but I do think it's probably important to have it at some stage written down, just so that I don't forget the highlights and the important lessons I've learned about life along the way. So getting past that blank sheet of paper and working out a plan how to get that book written. That's
great. I think recording our thoughts and ideas at some point in our life is a great thing to do. Certainly with somebody with your experience, Sue, I'd be fascinated to read whatever you wrote. You mentioned you had a blog there as well, but I'll ask you about that in a moment. Before I do, you very kindly have offered our listener a download. Could you tell me a little bit more about that in the context of our conversation today?
Yeah, it's a sample chapter from the book that I mentioned earlier in the conversation, the Risk book that myself and my fellow author Clive Staper wrote together. And it's really just helping people to look at risk, the concept of risk from all different perspectives. And so I hope that if the listener downloads that sample chapter, that it will start them to think about risk perhaps in some different ways, and maybe motivate them to do things that they hadn't imagined they were capable of.
That's brilliant. So you can download that from inspirationalcreatives.com/risk. That's inspirationalcreatives.com/risk. And thank you very much for that download, Sue. Finally, where can our listener find out more about you and all of your other work?
Lots of different places on social media. So simplest way would just be to type my name, Sue Stockdale, into Google and you'll find lots of things there. But I have a website, suestockdale.com. I have a podcast, accesstoinspiration.org. And I'm on all the social media, normally just under Sue Stockdale. And you'll hopefully find me there somewhere. And please do get in touch and let me know what you thought about this podcast. I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sue.
Thank you, Rob. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes, where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there.